as we have seen in our community, more folks struggling with pandemic fatigue, grief, loss, anxiety, and stress, we really wanted to focus our interview series this month on boosting mental well-being and kind of wrapping our minds around grief during COVID-19. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Brent Beam, a fantastic local psychologist here in the Asheville area who has over 15 years of experience counseling clients. We reached out to Dr. Beam because of his expertise in the areas of positive psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy, et cetera, and in the way in which in his practice, he works with clients to build their toolkit to find their center and live from a place of personal strengths and values, which during this time seems particularly useful. First and foremost, let me say thank you so much for doing this interview with us. Thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise today.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. So the very first question that kind of keeps coming up for our providers and many of our patients right now is what are some strategies we can be using for coping with the degree of pandemic fatigue we're all reaching at this point in time, and the stress, uncertainty, anxiety, fear, that particular soup of challenging emotions. Anything that you can offer tips and strategies wise for us?
It is a soup. Yeah, there's a lot loading on each of us right now, on a lot bearing on our communities, on our families, on our workplaces. And it's, I guess, first I would just state what I'm sure is very obvious, is it's very normal and appropriate to feel a lot of stress and anxiety and uncertainty and depression and hardship during this time. It's unprecedented for virtually everyone, and our lives have been turned upside down. And many of us are fortunate that there are still a lot of routines and things that are normal, and things that remain constant over time, but it's still been very stressful. I learn a lot about strategies, both from my reading and my training, but more and more from my clients, who kind of share with me how they've implemented different strategies to cope with situations. A lot of folks that I work with, and have over the last 11 months or so, have kind of intuited their way to gratitude as a strategy to cope with stress and uncertainty, focusing on things that are constant or reliable or stable, appreciating what does remain, even though a lot of things have changed. And so naming those things, either in conversation with a loved one or a friend, writing them down at the end of the day or the beginning of the day can be a useful strategy. There's an exercise from positive psychology called 3 Good Things, in which you write down at the end of every day 3 good things that happened to you that day. And then you write down an attribution. Why did that good thing happen? Was it because of luck? Because it reflects something about you and your choices? And the idea and what research bears out is that when we can name good things, it trains our mind to look for them. And when we do it at night, it tends to put us in a better space for healthy sleep. And better sleep means better mood the next day, usually. And if we can find attributions that do suggest that we are somewhat of an agent in our own positive experience, then we're more likely to see ourselves as protagonists in our own stories and not just victims of circumstances. So that, to be very concrete, I mean, that is a strategy that I think is a fine one to use as often as needed nowadays.
So first and foremost, accepting that soup of current challenges is normal. And just contextualizing the uncertainty and the stress, all of it, something that many of us are currently contending with, and to accept that as a normal thing for our circumstance. And then in terms of, I love how you zeroed in on the fact that as you've been working with your patients, many of them have intuited what they need. And so kind of maybe even checking in with yourself and saying, what would help me in this situation? But what many of your patients are gravitating towards is a gratitude practice. And in terms of positive psychology and the science of what we understand about the brain, at the end of the day, writing down 3 good things that happened that day, and then taking it one step further and kind of writing down how they happened or how they came about, what you did choice wise, behavior wise, that helped that good thing to take place. And
Yes.
those three things at night before bed to optimize sleep and mood, naming the three things, writing them down, and then bridging how your choices led to those three good things.
Yes. Yes. You've summed it really well. Yeah. And the three good things I'll add can be monumentally good things or extremely minor, kind of minutia. It can be, I don't know, I had a delicious sandwich for lunch and I enjoyed it. That could be a good thing. Or it could be my friend from 30 years ago finally reached out and reconnected with me. Either of those or anything in between is fine. It's really subjective, but the point is to account for them and then to find or imagine an attribution that feels real, that reflects something about your contribution to having that good experience.
The dots, which it seems to me that for some reason that reminded me of an interview that I read with a woman who survived the Holocaust, who's living in Toronto right now. She's in her 90s.
Mm-hmm.
It was at the beginning of the pandemic, and they asked her, how are you doing? Because she lived alone. And she said, I'm great. I have a roof over my head. I have food. Things are good.
Yes.
Like, okay, perspective and what you're choosing to focus on, and really claiming how your agency or how your choices impacted the good that's there. Those are things that can help us to grow our awareness of what is okay, even in the midst of what is hard.
Absolutely. And it brings to mind the writing of Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, which many people are familiar with. Mm-hmm. And then the front half of that book, he talks about his experience in a concentration camp. And the back half of the book talks about his kind of revised approach to psychiatry or psychotherapy at the time. And he focuses on the importance of making meaning when meaning doesn't otherwise exist in the world. And his argument, which a lot of people find useful, is that meaning is not inherent, that we have to create it. And for many people, the pandemic presents not a concentration camp-like experience, but one where meaning and structures have been lost or threatened, and there's a need to recreate that sense of purpose. So yes, to your point, and this woman's experience, having perspective, appreciating what is here, and making some meaning from that. I think many of us are doing that without consciously trying to do that. But what you bring up reminds me of the importance of being mindful of creating meaning in what otherwise is a very meaning challenging or meaning an experience that's not laden with a ton of meaning inherently.
Yeah. The way of owning your story and owning your experience in the moment, it seems to me, to imagine and construct, like, how can there be meaning right now? Mm-hmm. And there's some fun questions where you can kind of imagine that of, 6 months from now, looking back, what is the story of how I will have wanted ideally to navigate this time? Mm-hmm. What story will I want to tell my children or my best friends about how I got through it now?
Yes.
But it's that same writing the story and owning that. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And what you're saying also speaks to this kind of future casting strategy where you think, yes, about not necessarily future outcomes, but the process that you will have gone through to try to achieve an outcome, and hoping or setting yourself up to follow your values and follow your strengths so that your process will be aligned with your best self. Yes, so that afterward you can say, I feel totally proud of what I did. Right? Outcomes they can go either way, but I was my best self through the process. And positive psychology also speaks a lot about individual strengths and discerning what those are, and then practicing those on a regular basis in new and novel ways, not just the old ways, the familiar ways and easy ways, but finding yourself in a new situation where your strength is needed in a new way. One for me, for example, is I'll use my wife because I think it helps me to talk about her a little bit more than myself. One of her strengths is being in a state of awe and wonder.
Mm.
And she's born into the world with this kind of attitude of championing things and just being mesmerized quite easily. And during the pandemic, it has served her very well to be to have that strength and to apply it to otherwise very mundane situations.
Mm.
Being awestruck by the cheer that our dog brings to the family, or the plants that are growing in the garden, things that she might otherwise look over, or we might say, yeah, that's nice, but she's really savoring those right now. So there are many strengths, but that's one, and someone that I'm close to, I can speak about. Yeah.
Well, that I love the positive psychology emphasis on values and strengths. And I know that in your practice, that's one of the things that you work with your clients to do is help them to find their center and then, live in a way that is honoring strengths and values and, building the toolkit to let that be possible. Um, you know, for is there anything else from that positive psychology approach to behavior and, and
Mm.
building strengths that people can maximize on right now to try and find their center in the midst of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, I gotta say, what comes to mind is a bit of a tangential thought, but I think it connects in, and I hope it'll be useful. Is that yes, it's absolutely important to savor what we have, to be grateful, to put words to our strengths and use those in novel ways if we can. But there's another, arguably, kind of most important tenet of positive psychology, which is that other people matter. And it's this call to get outside of our own experience, outside of our own needs fulfillment, or even our own suffering, and to focus on other people. So that is, again, maybe not quite hitting the bullseye of your question, but I hope relevant. Something that I work with my patients and clients on is to think about other people. Who else in their life has needs? How else can they show up for them? How can you show up in your relationships in ways that will edify your relationship? Odds are, if you do that, your needs are going to get met. But it's different than saying, well, how can I get my needs met first and foremost?
To kind of connect the dots of what you said so far, which I think is a lot of really useful ideas and approaches, normalizing or accepting what is hard and seeing that as is a normal human reaction to the circumstance being drastically different than what we were used to. Losing structure, losing contact, disruption. And then focusing on gratitude practice at night, writing 3 good things down that happened that day and how you helped to make them happen. And focusing on your values and your strengths and really exploring them and imagining how the strengths that you've always had, how they could be newly applied right now. In particular, if we can start thinking about the other people in our community or in our lives and how we might be able to help them. And that in terms of what that does for our focus on strengths, values, serving, connection, all of that together begins to shift the paradigm from I'm scared and I'm alone to I have strengths and I'm serving and I'm helping others.
Well said. Yes, exactly.
Very empowering. Yeah.
It takes one from being a passive victim and focusing on one's own hurts to being an agent of change and building those connections up again.
Which it's interesting that you said this, but in different words. When you're helping others meet their needs, often you're getting your needs met as well. I think kind of like that, where being an agent of change for others is also inevitably going to be, and you're advocating change for yourself in the process.
Yeah, right. Yeah. There's plenty of opportunity right
now. To do kind of a leap from what's hard now in terms of stress and anxiety, the other kind of big issue that we're thinking about over at Integrative Family Medicine, and I think a lot of us are experiencing on different levels, is grief. The complicated nature of grief during COVID-19, grief for the loss of loved ones, for relationships that are estranged because life is different and it's hard to connect, grief for structure that isn't there, habits that we can't do. And I'm curious, how do you understand grief right now? How can you speak to that experience?
Yeah, you're really laying the land, kind of describing the landscape here, where um, grief isn't just about bereavement. I mean, bereavement is absolutely a significant way that we experience grief, um, but there's a grief now during pandemic times where we don't have the access to experiences that we're used to having. We don't have access to community. Um, Many of us don't have the sense of safety that we just kind of, I guess, had without even thinking about it before.
Mhm.
So there's a vulnerability that many people experience on a regular basis. What's complicated about it, I think, is that, and what makes grief itself complicated is when it's unresolved and when it lingers and doesn't have resolution. And um,
Mm.
many people have lost loved ones, as you've said. There are services, funerals, rituals that haven't occurred or haven't occurred like they would in normal times. So the grief experience doesn't get fully resolved or worked through or even activated for some people. It's on hold. And so that's very complicating. There's a vagueness and ambiguity to grief right now. I realized this recently. Just kind of had this epiphany that one thing that I've been grieving that I've not been able to have is the feeling of hope. I mean, I do now. Winter is turning into spring. I have some faith that the population will have some resiliency against the vaccine. But for a while there, I didn't even have enough hope, and I didn't recognize that that's what I was missing. I was just very grumpy for days and weeks on end. So I
Yeah,
think for a lot of people, there is some kind of hard to identify loss and ambiguous loss that's going on during pandemic time as well. Yeah.
absolutely. So ambiguous loss because of the inability to grieve for, you know, loved ones who have passed away in the way that we normally would. True bereavement, but unresolved bereavement, if
Mhm.
bereavement's ever resolved, but without being able to have
Mhm.
rituals that we would normally have necessarily,
Mhm.
or having them but imbued in, you know, extra stress and uncertainty. And then aside, in addition to that, these other ways of, you know, the current landscape of loss, you know, not having hope for the future, not having certainty or a background sense of it's, you know, safe to go to the grocery store. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
that is a loss unto itself. And then in addition to that, we don't have access to our community, to our friends, to the ability to travel or go and do experiences the way we would normally want to.
Mhm.
It's still different. Um,
It's still different.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important that it is still different, that no matter how you slice it, it's still the same. Right? We can talk about strategies, and I'm sure we will, about ways we can try to cope with this. But no matter how much you cope, it doesn't change the fact that we're still living in a pandemic. Right? There's still losses that we still have to contend with on a regular basis.
yeah, losses, and as you just zeroed in right in the beginning, a certain degree of uncertainty about the future, which, if you don't have a sense of hope that it will be okay, or a sense of faith it's going to be okay, how does that translate into your mood throughout the day? How does that translate into how you're interacting with the news, interacting with your loved ones? And that to me is one of the more insidious forms of grief right now, or loss, is that loss of perceived collective knowing of future, more or less what it will look like.
Absolutely.
I'm so curious if you have any suggestions or ideas for how to support one another in the midst of that, you know, uncertainty, hopelessness, loss.
Yeah. I have a couple of ideas. One is coming from a therapist, to talk about your feelings. um,
Process. Yeah.
right? Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to just say, "Well, yeah, I'm feeling." We all feel it. We don't need to talk about it because we all know what's going on. I,
Mhm.
I I think we all do feel it, and we all need to talk about it. When we talk about our feelings, then we give them life, and we give them a chance to dissipate and to ease a little bit. Um, doesn't always happen that way, but it's more likely when we talk about it than when we keep it to ourselves. So I do find it personally very cathartic to talk about my stress and my grief. My clients, and I trust anyone's clients, would find it helpful to talk about it, to have our feelings acknowledged and understood. We can kind of, to borrow a phrase from another therapist, we can undo the aloneness of the experience by talking about our feelings. It doesn't mean that, again, you and I are chatting over video, but at least we're talking, we're engaged in some interactive process that puts us in contact with each other. I'm a little bit less alone. You're a little bit less alone because we're having a conversation together, right? So I don't think we can overdo talking about our feelings at this point in time. So that actually would be a strategy I'd suggest. It can be with a therapist, with a close friend, partner, clergy member, your dog, like whatever, but just to vocalize it can be really important. To get back to something we were talking about before, many of the markers of time passing, the thresholds, the rituals, the rites of passage that we're used to don't exist, or they're not as accessible as they were before. But I think we can still create those on our own. A friend of mine, he and his wife and their neighbors, they have 2 daughters. They have just transitioned from a homeschool experience to being in the classroom again. And to celebrate that transition, my friend and his group had a little fire in the evening and had a little stick over the fire, and the girls safely jumped over the stick across the fire, and they had some, I don't know what they said something important. They honored that this was a moment, something new was happening. It was worth marking in some way.
Yeah.
And I take that as, for me personally, a very instructive example of, it can be anything. It can be as simple as a fire in the backyard, or just mentioning, hey, we're transitioning from this to that. Any way we can mark the passage of time reminds us that time isn't static, that things do move forward, right? That we're moving into another phase. We don't yet know what it's going to be, but we're not in the old phase fully anymore. So that would be another thing I'd recommend.
It also the concept of marking time passing and trying to either keep the rituals you had in the past and continue, adapt them in some way to now, but continue them, or create new ones, reminds me of what we were talking about earlier in terms of story and kind of finding meaning, even if there isn't any, but creating your own meaning, creating your own story, and marking, transition as a special occasion. Those girls, I imagine, are going to think back to that and smile. And so even though it's just, jumping over a stick over a fire, it becomes something that is more, just like your wife looking at the garden and not just seeing a garden and going on, but taking a moment to just sink into the awe of the dew and the sound of the bugs, or currently the frozen ice crystals on top of the kale, whatever it is. Right. These ways to almost anchor ourselves in the moment and find something to celebrate, which not only marks the passage of time, but also in a way anchors us to what is still good. That sounds really important right now.
It does. It does, and it is really important. Yeah. You probably know some of the work of Mary Oliver, poet Mary Oliver. I mean, she talks about both of these aspects, the aspect of marking the passage of time and of being in nature, right? Appreciating the natural world, that it still beats on, that the cycles are still in process, the seasons still turn. We're experiencing a pandemic, but the rest of the natural world, or most of it, is still going. It's still fine. And to remember that we do still have our place in this natural world, to see that around us, to savor that, to create story around that. Yeah, I believe there's a lot of power and a lot of freedom to be had in that, and can be potentially a very profound way to cope with the grief and just the ambiguity and the monotony of being in what otherwise feels like a very static, kind of stuck part of the story.
Makes me think of her poem Wild Geese, the concept of here we are, a human, caught up in all of the emotions of being human, and the geese are still flying and the sun is still setting. I don't remember the exact words, but that general image being evoked. And so again, to recap, what we can do in the midst of the grief and the loss and the uncertainty is we can speak our emotions, not repress them, but truly give them a voice so that we can be processing and reaching out either to a therapist, to a psychologist, to a close loved one, someone who is safe. Just keep processing.
Yes, yes.
And or the dog, as you said.
Or the dog. I'm a big fan of dog therapy.
Yeah. They're therapy dogs for a reason. And then beyond that, really marking the passage of time and finding ways to recognize that this isn't static. The pandemic as it is happening right now this isn't how it will be forever.
That's right.
And to remember, get outside and to remember that there, to find what is still good right now and to use your personal strengths and values to really create for yourself ways to anchor yourself to what is good right now. As it sounds like ultimately a way of building resilience.
Can I add one more piece to this?
Please, absolutely. Yes.
Which again, I'm sure is so basic, but I think it never hurts to repeat during this time, which is that even though we're physically distancing, it doesn't mean we have to socially distance. Right? We can still be in touch with our friends and our loved ones. We can still have video chats, as laborious as they may be. We can still do it. We can send texts. We can even write letters. We can send emails. We can. There are a lot of ways we can have contact, and that contact is another, again, really crucial ingredient in humans' resilience, is having that interpersonal contact to feel that we are seen and known and cared for. We're part of a tribe. We need that. It's part of our how we survive. It's absolutely necessary. So I just want to be one among many voices to continue to encourage everyone to make connections, even if it's tiresome to do so. It's still really important right now to stay connected, even if you're physically distant, to not be socially distant from each other.
Connection is a way to build resilience, but it's also important not just for me, but for whoever I'm reaching out to. Having a sustained sense of being a part of community, tribe, family is really important to human mental health because we are social. Can't emphasize that enough. Any way that you can make it happen.
Agree, yes.
Okay. And it seems to me like, from what I understand about the psychology of the human brain, and I defer to you 100% on this, but from what I understand, when someone feels scared or uncertain, the tendency can be to withdraw in some way, on that personality and that person. But in general, someone who is stressed or scared or depressed might be more prone to not go out as much, to not answer the phone as much, to withdraw a little bit. And so the fact that there's this artificial structure that kind of has us separated from each other, and then there's also the stress and the anxiety, means that it might feel harder to set up the video call now, but it's more important than ever to do so for you and for whoever you are calling.
Yes, I agree. I mean, it's like the deck is really stacked against us as a collective. But yes, also for anyone who is also depressed or tends in that direction, yeah, you're absolutely right about all that. Many people live in neighborhoods where there are people walking dogs on the street or out when the day is at least halfway decent. And it might not equate to a real conversation or a real deep connection, but even being around humans can be helpful. Putting on your boots, going for a walk to the mailbox and back, or going down the street and back, making eye contact with other people. There are still ways. I don't mean to suggest it's easy, because for some people it's very, very difficult. But I think you're absolutely right that it's more important than ever right now. And I think the timing of our interview is worth noting, that we're in mid September. I don't even know. We've lost all sense of time. We're in mid-February. The spring is not that far away. The weather will pick up. The sun will be out more. It'll be warmer. We can all get outside, move our bodies in the outdoor air. It should be easier for many of us once the weather starts to shift a little bit in that direction.
Yeah, yeah. This is kind of the last of the hard months where we have, because that's the unique pandemic fatigue people have reached, is that it is, we're a month away from spring. It's been a winter of pandemic, political tension, and more. And so there's just a lot.
Yes, there's a lot weighing on us.
It can be hard at this point to think about how to boost your mental well-being. But I really appreciate the things that you've pointed out in terms of just gratitude practice, but coming at it from looking at what you are doing to help the good things happen and doing it before bed, so that then, right before bed, you have this positive focus and with others, and kind of really creating meaning where you can in your life right now, and finding the passage of time and really noting it. And again, reaching out to others and asking, how can I help others be meeting their needs, and getting creative about whatever you feel comfortable doing, whether that's a walk to the mailbox and waving at the neighbor, or writing letters, whatever it is.
Yes, all of it. Any and all of it.
Any and all of it. Is there anything else that you want to add, or that you feel like people should be thinking about right now before we wrap up our conversation?
No. Well, I guess the only other thing is that this is not an exhaustive list. We've all got our own idiosyncratic, very creative ways of coping during times like this. Yeah. So I hope whoever hears this and takes it in will also know that these are just ideas meant to supplement what's already working, or to kind of stimulate some new ideas. There's a high call to be resilient and to pull out all the stops right now. So yeah, as I say to my clients, go forth and conquer. Let's take this in.
Go forth and try new things and do whatever. Now is a good time to experiment and build on what you've already figured out works for you.
There you go.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise. We really
My pleasure. Thank you.